Hi, everybody. Welcome to Conversations with Bizzy. I hope you enjoyed today's story. And if you do, please subscribe. Here we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Conversations with Bizzy. It is episode 537. And I'm so excited to have Carrie here. The craziest thing, you guys know that follow me all the time, know that I have crazy things that happen in my life all the time. And I met Carrie on Ash Wednesday at Bethesda by the Sea. We were there. It was a beautiful service. And I feel so, I was like, it was just serendipitous, right? God works in mysterious ways, doesn't he, Carrie?
Always.
Always. And it was so great that she was put in front of me. And then I saw her on Instagram and I'm like, I have to reach out and see if she'll come on my show. Because once I realized who Carrie really is and how amazing her story is, I had to reach out and see if she'd come on my show. So welcome so much, Carrie. And thank you for saying yes.
Of course. And what she's leaving out is that my dress was unzipped in the back and she kindly zipped it up for me. I even checked it in the car on the way over and I thought I had zipped it up, but I obviously didn't. And I think that was serendipitous that I didn't do it properly. So you literally got my back, Elizabeth. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Where you looked so perfect. I mean, everything, her bag, her shoes, her dress was absolutely beautiful. And all of a sudden I noticed the back of her dress was only halfway zipped. And I'm like, do you want me to zip it the rest of the way? And she said, yes. And we all can do that, right? Especially if we don't have somebody there to like have our back, literally. So I was happy to help. I want to give everybody your bio because if they don't know who Carrie Sheffield is, they need to know. So Carrie is a journalist. She is an author. She's a policy analyst and a broadcaster whose life story is inspiring as it is powerful. She is the author of Motorhome Prophecies, a journey of healing and forgiveness, a deeply personal memoir where she shares her path from a chaotic childhood to becoming a Harvard-educated leader with a passion for truth, faith, and resilience. Carrie began her career as a journalist, then she went to finance, and now she's back in journalism. She's been published in the Wall Street Journal, Time, USA Today, and many others. She's also appeared as a commentator on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, BBC, PBS, and HBO. I had to throw that in there. She's the founder of Bold TV, a digital network spotlighted in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. And she is currently a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, using her voice to advocate for freedom, opportunity, and empowerment. She's also a world traveler, being to all 7 continents, including Antarctica. It's crazy. And she's an avid runner. And I just think your story from where you came from, especially during Lent and where we are in our world today, is such a story of hope.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for the bio. I apologize if it's so long, but I appreciate your support and I appreciate that you want to uplift women and other people. And I showed up at that Lent service and, we all have things we struggle with. And I love the season of Lent because it's where we can be reborn. We can acknowledge our struggles. We can acknowledge our sins. We can forgive ourselves. We can forgive others. We can get that forgiveness from God and that assurance that we can redirect the ship. And that's what I love for my Lenten. I had a Lenten goal and I've been sticking to it for the most part. I think I've been doing pretty well. So, but yeah, I think the goal for me to write my story and share it with others is because I know how hard it is to be without hope. And so I did want to share a story of hope.
Well, and I think you mentioned the word forgiveness a couple times there. And I think that so many of us find it so hard to forgive, right? We carry around these burdens on our backs like a backpack. And we're like, oh my gosh, I can't let this go. And we hold on so tight, but it doesn't hurt us. We think we're hurting somebody else, but we're actually hurting ourselves, aren't we?
That's what they say, that unforgiveness is drinking poison yourself and hoping the person who hurt you will die. But you're right. And it is a heavy, heavy burden, especially when we don't forgive ourselves. And I know for people who struggle with addiction, quite often addiction stems from self-hatred and feeling shame and feeling unforgiveness for ourselves. And for me, it was interesting. I didn't have substance abuse, but I had my own addictions. I was addicted to approval of others. I was addicted to success, the dopamine hits of feeling achievement, to the point where I was feeling suicidal. And because I wasn't getting the hits enough that made me feel satisfied. And I checked myself in because I was so suicidal and depressed, into a psychiatric unit for a few days. And I was in there with drug addicts and alcoholics. And I looked around and I'm like, I'm not addicted to drugs. I've never done drugs. I'm not addicted to alcohol. I don't even drink. I used to drink for a while, but then like I don't drink because I'm naturally extroverted, and I just felt like I dated a guy who didn't drink for health reasons, and so I just ended up stopping drinking. And so I was like, why am I here surrounded by addicts? What am I addicted to? And I really had to confront myself, and that's the forgiveness piece. Was I had to forgive myself. I think quite often we beat ourselves up more than anybody else, and we say things to ourselves that we would never dream to say to anybody else, especially women. We tend to internalize shame and aggression. These are broad generalizations, and men tend to act it out. But either way, it's an imbalance, and so being honest with ourselves, for me, was a big step in recovery.
It's so true, because don't we feel like we have like imposter syndrome? Like, why am okay, I'm not getting this. I'm getting accolades that I'm doing the right thing, but I still don't think I'm good enough.
Exactly. And the comparison, comparison is such a deadly disease. And so, just for a little bit of context for folks, if they haven't read the book, it's, as you can see on the title, as you held up, it's called Motorhome Prophecies, because I grew up largely in a motorhome, but also in sheds and tents, and but also houses. But it was all over. And by the end, I went to 17 public schools and homeschool. My mother gave birth to one of my brothers when our family lived in a tent, homeless, didn't have a hospital, literally gave birth in a campground in a tent. And by the time I got to high school and graduated, I'd attended 17 public schools and homeschool all over the country. And the, you know, that senior year, I was living in a shed with my 7 biological siblings and our parents. So 10 people living in a shed with no running water and no furnace in the Ozarks of Missouri. And it was just a place of despondency. And the reason we live this way is because my father, I believe he was a religious addict. And might sound weird to people, but religious addiction is a real thing. Because when you look at the brain patterns, they've done MRI scans of people who are going through a religious experience. It's the same brain patterns as someone who is experiencing drug addiction or alcoholism or pornography addiction or gambling addiction. It's the same brain patterns when taken to the extreme. But when it's done, when faith and religion are done in a healthy way, it gives a healthy, natural chemical release that is stabilizing. But when taken to the extreme, as in the case of my father, it was so destabilizing for him because he was addicted to the feeling of the euphoria of the religious superiority, of feeling grandiose. So he claimed he was a prophet. That's why the book's called Motorhome Prophecies. And he was a Mormon prophet, that he was sent by God, that he was going to save America from destruction. And he was eventually excommunicated from the Mormon church. So I let people know that what he did was not sanctioned by the official LDS church, because that organization I believe does a lot of good in the world. They do a lot of great charity work. I have a lot of family and friends who are still in it. But my dad was so extreme that he interpreted Mormon theology in an extremely grandiose way. The Mormon theology teaches that righteous Mormon males can have their own planet. So it created for my dad this sense of grandiosity and this religious addiction in his brain. And he said the Holy Ghost wanted us to live this way. He was, and I try to be as fair and honest about him in the book as possible, because he had been molested by a babysitter when he was very young. And he said as an adult that made him feel suicidal. And unfortunately, 4 of my siblings have attempted suicide, and I was suicidal. And just a really bad place for mental health. And so the journey of the book is about that journey of recovering my mental health. And as the Bible says, do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that's what the book's about, is because I do believe that God wants us. I now call this journey for me a journey of healthy faith, because I was living under extreme abusive religious faith. And then the other extreme, for 12 years, I did not believe in God. I was agnostic. I hated the idea of God. I said, if there is a God, he hates me and I hate him back. But eventually, through God's amazing grace, as we said, he works very mysteriously. I was able to find that middle, that healthy faith, and to walk in the knowledge that I am a child of God, that even if my earthly father disappointed me, my true father is in heaven and he adores me. And to even feel adored is a foreign concept when you're going through addiction.
It is so, from your book and just watching what you've done in your life, you're a miracle on so many levels. Because to think you had 7 siblings, your 3, I know, was it 3 brothers that were schizophrenic that are older than you?
Two brothers. Two of my brothers are schizophrenic. Yeah.
So when you for one, you moved around 15 times, 15 different high schools. That's traumatic. Then
Yeah,
to think
17 public schools and homeschool over K through 12. Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah.
You didn't ever have those firm roots, right? Where you could feel safe ever.
Yeah. And, I say in the book, being poor, there's no shame in being poor. This isn't about living in a motorhome or mobile home and living in a trailer park, like looking down my nose at all. It's about that combination of poverty and mental illness and abuse together creates a lot of problems, because I'm sure we've all heard stories, and I've traveled to the developing world. Some of the poorest people can be the happiest, and that's if we have love. And unfortunately, we had abuse instead of the love and nurturing that we needed. And so this is what happens. And we see this in wealthy homes, very, very wealthy homes. If they have child abuse, it can create similar outcomes to what I dealt with. And it's interesting. I've been touring the country since the book came out. I've had more than 40 events, spoken to almost 8,000 people in person in different events. And people sometimes say to me, wow, I have nothing to complain about in my life ever after hearing your story. And I say, well, if I'm drowning in 20 feet water, or if I'm drowning in 200 feet water, I'm still drowning. And so it's not about comparing, because at the end of the day, as an American, I am very blessed compared to the rest of the world. And so for me, what I've seen is focusing on the blessings and the abundance and the joy in my life. It creates more of that. Whereas when we're struggling with trauma, when we're struggling with addiction, we focus on the negative in our life, and that ends up creating more negativity in our life. It almost becomes like a prayer, a negative prayer, like a prayer for destruction, a prayer for lack. Whereas our prayers, when they're filled with gratitude, we create more beauty and more abundance in our life.
So true. So tell me this. So I saw in one of the photos that BYU, Brigham Young University, was a big thing in your family. Obviously, it was something your parents wanted, at least probably all of you to go to, right? And so was that natural that you went there originally when you graduated from high school?
No, well, it was interesting because when we were younger, yes, I think I put a birthday cake for when my brother I share a birthday just a couple of days apart in February with my brother, and my mom had made him a BYU birthday cake. She had put a big Y, because that's the symbol. If you go to BYU, there's a big Y on the mountain, and they call it the Y after Brigham Young. And and my father had been a professor at Brigham Young, so he had been a professor of guitar, and he had incredible gifting as a musician. And unfortunately, it became an unstable situation, and he had some conflicts because he was dealing with his own trauma responses and his own, uh, mental illness. And in any case, as time went on, unfortunately, as adults, my parents began to be anti BYU because they thought it was too weak. They thought it was too weak sauce Mormons. Like, they thought, as my parents became more extreme, they thought that mainstream Mormonism was pandering, and that it wasn't authentic Mormonism. And so I had to fight to get to BYU. I went there in spite of my parents. I mean, I'm 42, and I have not spent a night under my parents' roof. And I've basically spent my entire adult life living with their disapproval. But again, focusing on who my true father is, has helped me get rid of what I've learned is known as the orphan spirit. There's the orphan spirit, and then there's the childship or the sonship or the daughtership spirit. And the orphan spirit, in my case, was developed in part because when I left home, part of why I left home was when I was 17. One of my older schizophrenic brothers tried to rape me. He groped me, and then he tried to kill himself and was taken to a psych unit temporarily, and eventually came back home. And eventually got to the point where I woke up and I'm like, I'm living in a motorhome with 10 people, including a 200-pound man who wants to rape me. Like, that is the definition of hell on earth. And so I began to question, is my father a prophet? I went on a discernment period. I go into depth of how that was for me. But eventually I realized he's not a prophet. He's a false prophet. And I need to go away, and I want to go away to college. And so I raised my right hand, I told my father I want to go to college. And he raised his right hand, like making an oath, or like swearing testimony. And he said, I prophesy in the name of Jesus, you will be raped and murdered if you leave. And so, that's speaking a negative prophecy over your child. And I believe spiritually, that's one of the worst things someone can do to you. And he said, at that point, I did choose to leave. It's kind of one of those, I think you'll appreciate gallows humor. It's like, my brother tried to rape me. My dad says if I leave, I'm getting raped. I'm getting raped. Like, So it's like, I got to make a choice here. And I did choose freedom, and I chose to leave. And he said my blood changed, that I was no longer his daughter. I was not allowed home all through college, because he said I was satanic and I would corrupt my siblings. I was the first to leave, even though I'm number 5 in the birth order. So it was a lot easier to isolate the first and make them the black sheep. Families have different roles, and one of them is the black sheep role. And I have basically been in that role my whole adult life. And so that's going back to what I said earlier. That experience created an orphan spirit in me. And the orphan spirit is one who's operating in lack. It's one who's operating in insecurity. It's one who's operating in feeling like you'll never be enough. It's operating in a spirit of jealousy. It's operating in a spirit of just lack of peace. It's operating in a spirit of anxiety, because when you're an orphan, you don't know where your next meal is coming from. And even though I eventually was able to get jobs, like you said, in finance, was making good money, you can take the girl out of the orphanage, so to speak, but you can't. It's harder to take the orphan out of the girl. And so the journey in the book is about how, and I'm still even developing this spirit of daughtership, this spirit of childship, that I am worthy, I am loved, I am blessed, I am protected, I am all the things that my heavenly Father wants for me, even if my earthly father failed me in these respects.
I mean, Carrie, you really think about it, like how many people have, as much as they see around them, they know what's going on is not right, right? There's so many people who see that. They're like, I don't know, my mom's not right. This, my dad's not right. What they're saying doesn't make sense. 2 + 2 does not equal 4 here. But most of them don't have the courage to get up and go. And especially after your dad said to you, you're done. All these horrible things are going to happen to you, but you didn't care. You kept walking. How where did you find the courage to do that? Because so many people can't, and they're like, they get stuck with the abuser. It might even be a husband. It might be the mom. It might be the dad. It might be the wife that is the abuser. And so many people don't have the courage because they're like, I'm not going to be able to support myself. How am I going to be able to do this? And you did it. And how can we share this hope that you had with others, that you were able to say, I don't care. I have to just keep walking?
Yeah. Yeah. My heart breaks for people who are in these situations. And um, I think for me, as you mentioned, my day job, I work for a conservative women's group, and I don't want to get political because I think these ideas should be nonpartisan, but I do believe that in America, we are so blessed. And if we work hard and if we are committed to bettering ourselves and playing by the rules and living in service and living in abundance and that work ethic, we can succeed by ourselves, but in a system that is designed to uplift people who work hard and are willing to be productive. And so that is the big setting of how I was able to do this. Internally, how I was able to do it, a big part of it was my faith. Um, because when I went on that discernment period, is my father a prophet or not? I found some of his writings that he had handwritten down, and they were very disturbing to me. And when I found them, that was when I decided I was going to leave. And so I knelt down to God and I prayed and I said, God, I feel like I am leaving and I'm making this choice. And if you want me to stay, please show me. Please give me evidence. Please give me a sign to stay. Otherwise, I plan to leave. And I immediately felt peace after that point. And so knowing that I was protected, and also knowing the alternative of staying, that was a big motivator too. I say in the book, my brother's attack was a big catalyst for me to question everything. And so I say in the book, sometimes life's most wrenching crucibles lead us to our greatest moments of freedom. And so sometimes if you're in an abusive situation, sometimes you just hit a breaking point and you say, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to make changes. And so I guess it was a combination of carrots and sticks. But most importantly, my prayer is, and I was in a constant state of prayer when I was in that process of leaving.
It's so amazing. For one, what you just said about living in America. Like, I live in South Florida. I'm so grateful I live in Florida. I love my governor. People that listen to my show know that I'm very conservative. That's my values as well. And I think we take for granted so many times that we do live in America and we do have options. And all we need to do is go out and ask for it and keep walking and having the faith, like you just described, and knowing that there is a God. Because I think in society today, God has become like put in the corner, for lack of a better word. And today we're welcoming him more and more back. I mean, the churches that I go to, I mean, their enrollment, people that are joining the church have gone up substantially since, especially since 2016. And it's such an amazing thing. And that's what I love so much about you and your spirit, is that you keep just doing it, even though it's scary, because fear is such a debilitating feeling, right? Fear. What is going to happen? Where am I going to be? I don't have that quote unquote, and I'm doing air quotes if you guys are just listening to this, of like knowing I have a family that I can fall back on. Well, no, you didn't. You did not have a family you could fall back on. In fact, your father told you with no uncertainty, you are no longer welcome. And you walked anyway. And that is, it's unbelievable in some aspects.
Yeah, it's interesting just hearing people casually talk about their parents or their family. It's people don't know what they have. It's easy. And same thing in many other gifts that I do have. Sometimes I forget what I have. And so it's so easy to focus on what we don't have.
Right. And
And
I think gratitude is such an amazing attitude to have in so many ways. Because I'm sitting here now looking at you through the screen. I see you sit. You have a beautiful sofa behind you. You have paintings, pictures all over behind you. And to think that when you were growing up, you had none of that stability.
yeah, no, it's I used to feel guilty about having nice things actually, because my mother, she didn't create a home environment like this, because she said that basically God wanted us to suffer because we needed to do this in order to fulfill God's call for my dad. And I respect people who are not materialistic, that they don't want to let nice things control them. They don't want to worship false idols. I respect all that. But I do think there is a balance between uh, becoming obsessed and materialistic, and then going in the other ditch, which is allowing your children to starve or feeding them grass. Like my mother literally fed us grass from a city park because we didn't have food. That was like our stew that she made. And we were on public welfare, taking food from the government. We were taking food from the Mormon church. The LDS church has a very extensive food welfare program. So it's like, she took from the abundance of others, from the taxpayers and the tithing payers of the LDS church. Well, how did they create those food? Because they had jobs, they were creating. And so it, to me now as an adult, I didn't understand. I don't agree with that. I think to live a life of giving and abundance means that you do help people who are less fortunate. But in my dad's case, he didn't need to live this way. He was choosing this because he had allowed religious addiction to crowd out any sense of healthy normalcy. And that's what addiction does. Addiction shatters, destroys, distorts. Um, and so I had to go through in the book, I have my own self-sabotage that I had to uh, work through. And I would recommend to anybody who wants to, if you're feeling stuck or wanting a subconscious rewiring, there's an amazing program that I went through, and it was life-changing for my subconscious. It's called the Atlas Project. The website's just atlasproject.org. They used to be on the East Coast before COVID, and then they had to shut down. They were in Boston and New York, but now they're currently only in Texas, in Austin, Texas, and Las Vegas. I went through the Texas program, and it was phenomenal. And what this program did was it showed me how much I had allowed my parental self, encoding to then create self-sabotage within myself. And this is why quite often we see generational curses of addiction passed down, an alcoholic, their child becomes an alcoholic and their child becomes an alcoholic, or a drug addict and their child is a drug addict, or their child is, an abuser, their child, or they are abused and abused. In my mother's case, my grandmother stayed with my grandfather, who was a repeated cheater on her. He also physically abused my aunt, and my grandmother did not stop that. And so my mother saw that example, and then she reproduced that with her children, where her husband's abusing her own kids. She doesn't stop it. And so it's just, the scriptures in the Bible, it's full of both generational blessing and generational curses. The Bible talks about curses being passed down from generation to generation. And it's got to be someone who stops that. I mean, just to say, I am stopping this generational curse. It stops with me. I am putting us in the name of Jesus. I am stopping this curse on my bloodline, because I will not allow the behavior to be subconsciously encoded in me again.
That is unbelievable, because I know people that did not grow up in a motorhome, grew up in a great zip code in America, went to the best schools, didn't move schools 15 times, and still have that generational voices in their head, right? That's saying like what we carry and how we're going to change these things. And I love that you reached out for help, because so many people don't. And then what happens is it goes on to the next generation, the children that they're having today. And it's changing that voice, because I remember for myself personally, I had the voice of my mother in my head for so long. And I tell people all the time that I remember falling to my knees in Wayne, Pennsylvania, in my home with my children, and saying to God, please remove this voice from me. And God finally took it away. And I'm still so grateful for it today, because sometimes I think back to the way I used to run my life and the voices that I would say to myself and the way I would talk to myself, like you talked about earlier, which was so abusive. And changing that and getting to a place of forgiveness. Like, my mother's passed on now, and it's been, I have to say, I know this may sound dark, but it gave me such peace when I knew that she was no longer walking on this planet. And I know with your father, he has Alzheimer's now, correct?
He does, yeah. And it's actually caused him to be, in some respects, just kind of docile, because he can't remember how to control as much as he used to. And I love what you shared about how you were able to break that voice away from you. And that's a miracle. You're a miracle too. And I think half of the battle quite often is awareness, that you are aware of that voice, because so much of the subconscious is below. It's like an iceberg. 95% of the iceberg is below the water, and then that 5% is the conscious and what I think I want. But the subconscious is what I actually think I am and what I deserve. And so in my case, the way that showed up was that even though I had done lots of work and I had, succeeded in my career, I was in denial about the effects of trauma on my subconscious. And so I was high achieving. I got to Harvard, I got to Goldman Sachs, all these big resume things. But inside, I still had that subconscious toxic programming. And the way that showed up was that I ended up continually dating one after the other, a pattern of, one was a drug addict, one was having major alcohol problems, two of them were cheating. And another was verbally abusive and emotionally abusive and controlling. And So it's like the same man with different names over and over and over again. And even though in my conscious, I would say, I don't want this. My subconscious told me this is who you are and this is what you want because you're unworthy. And so you will be with a man who treats you like you're unworthy because you believe you're unworthy. And so quite often, and even the Bible says, there's a verse that says, why do I keep doing things that I don't want to do? And that's what the subconscious is. The subconscious is what we actually want. The conscious is what we think we want. And once we realize how you realized your mother's voice, which had come into your subconscious, when we have alignment of the conscious and subconscious, when it actually is what we want, that's when we have the breakthroughs.
And now, how are you dating somebody now?
Stay tuned on that. Yes, I don't want to go public, but let's just say I know what I want, and I know what is healthy, and I know what is what I deserve. And I think the part of the problem, I think, in modern society is that we chase after external things and shiny resumes, and external success, both ourselves and what we look for in a spouse. And I'm reconfiguring what I desire. I'm reconfiguring all of that, and that is earth shattering. I was on autopilot, and I'm not anymore, and it's refreshing to date in that mindset.
It's a game changer. It's a total game changer. When you go to the realizing, I know that all the shiny objects and the materialism is fun. Let's face it, it is. I like it. It's easier to be able to buy fun things and pretty things than it is not to. But that isn't about the whole thing, right? God is all about the insides. It was always about the outsides for me when I was drinking. I was like all about, okay, well, I have the finest shoes. I have the finest handbag. Everything's perfect. I drive a nice car. But the reality was I was attracting things that weren't good for Elizabeth. And I didn't realize that till I hit my rock bottom and realized, and I had somebody older and wiser look at me and go, Elizabeth, you've got it wrong. It's not, you do look pretty. Your outfit's great, but how is your insides? And that takes courage to change your insides. It's hard. It's not easy.
No, and to have the courage and the humility, to, because once you hit rock bottom, I mean, you can always go under the grave. That's
Yeah.
that's the downward continued spiral. And I almost died. That's what I talk about in the book. From an allergic reaction to a drug they gave me when I was in the hospital for my suicide level fibromyalgia pain. So I was almost below 6 feet under rock bottom. And but I had gotten to that point because I was so addicted to what I was doing with my startup that I was allowing it to, as I said, by the end, I was not running the startup was running me. And I had allowed it to become my false idol, my God, my everything, that all I thought about. It was basically my own little micro cult. And that's just whatever it is, whether it's an alcohol bottle or drugs. It becomes a little micro cult that we worship. And so a big theme of the book is also about my Christian journey and journey into understanding. There's an amazing book after you read Motorhome Prophecies that I talk about in the book called Counterfeit Gods by Tim Keller.
Oh, I love
and I
him.
love how faith has been such a big part of your story. But this book, each chapter is a false idol that we as humans worship instead of God. So whether that's money, power, fame, sex, family, whatever it is, choose your addiction. And quite often they are good things, quite often they are things that, I mean, they're gifts from God. But once we start to worship the gift instead of the giver of the gift, that's when our life becomes disordered. And that's when our lives fall apart. And when I was going through my baptismal process, my confirmation class for Episcopal, one of the things they taught us in the class was the divine order.
Mm.
And the divine order of life is living God first, people, things. And the way I was living my life as agnostic, I was living people, things, didn't care about God. And I think that that's what's happening in society more broadly. But you're right. We're now seeing a trend of people coming back to God, and that's what I think is another amazing thing about America is we were founded with a motto, "In God we trust." If you look at human history, that's shocking because it's typically in the emperor I trust, in the king I trust,
Mm-hmm.
or I have no
Mm-hmm.
choice but to live under their thumb,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how order is maintained. Or in the political party I trust. In the case of China, in the CCP I trust, or in the Soviet Union, in the Communist Party I trust. Well, at the end of the day, when each of us is living our lives in God we trust, God's our ultimate authority. It's not some person. It's not a president. It's not a king. And that's what makes America so unique, because it's giving the freedom to each citizen to have a direct connection with God. And that's why the CCP hates religion so much, because they don't want anything to come between the people and God, or themselves. They want to be the ultimate authority. And so that's something that I love about America. And even George Washington, our founding father, he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, America will only work with religious people.
Yeah.
Because if we lose sight of "In God we trust," the highest authority, God, people, things, this American experiment is going to collapse.
Well, it's so funny because the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, they tried to get the founder, Bill Wilson, went to Rockefeller saying, "Can you give me money to help me take this to the next level?" And Rockefeller said, "No, if you get money involved, it will never work. It has to be God driven." They call it a higher power to help people come in. But in the end, most people that I know that are long-term alcoholics in sobriety have a higher power, which they call God. And that has been, the Dalai Lama said it's the best thing to come out of the Western Hemisphere is Alcoholics Anonymous, which is so, and America, we've forgotten that it was in God we trust. We forget that the founding people that came over here were looking for religious freedom. And now they don't want that at all. They want it just to be, it feels like everybody wants to be sheep. We aren't allowed to have individuality. We're supposed to like the same things, drive the same cars. You walk into people's homes today, and I'm old enough to remember that you would go and you take your mom's old stuff, and mom's old stuff would be what you would put in your house because it all had a story, rather than everybody going to the same pottery barn and looking the exact same. And I think we need to embrace our individuality and our brains and our minds, because God made each and every person walking on this planet special exactly the way that they are. And there's something I want to talk about with you, which I think is so important, is this forgiveness, because I spoke about it earlier. And I feel like we're living in such a divisive time. It's never been like this, at least in my lifetime. And I was born in 1968, right? So when I was growing up and somebody was a Democrat or somebody was a Republican, it didn't really matter. We'd still have them to the dinner party. It wasn't this, we have such antagonism towards others and so much hate. And especially if you voted for, I voted for Donald Trump. I can tell you that. And I'm proud of saying that. I've been a MAGA supporter. I've voted for him 3 times. I believe in the movement. I am a proud card carrying member. And I have friends that don't believe the same way I do. So they don't want to be my friend anymore.
No, and I think that's really sad because they are ultimately giving power to the very person that they say they despise, and they're allowing that person to control their personal life. I can't think of anything more disempowered than that. If that's their way of trying to punish you, uh, and punish him, ultimately they're only punishing themselves because they are showing who they truly are. They're showing that they want to be divided. They're showing that, I know some people say, "Oh, it's a MAGA cult," but it's like they're the ones who are actually living their life in a cult-like mentality, which is to cut people off. I mean, that's what my father did when he said, "Your blood changed and you're no longer my daughter." I mean, that's same thing. It's allowing the identity for my dad's case as his own basically cult leader. His identity as a cult leader was so strong that it couldn't overpower his position as my father, who was supposed to be loving me. And so people who make their politics their God, they're worshiping politics instead of God. And that creates separation and division, even though we are truly just all one. We are all children of God. And one Bible verse for people who don't read the Bible, this is one that used to catch me when I was not a Christian. And it says in the Bible that God is love. 3 little words. And I thought that verse was sneaky because I believed in love. I didn't believe in God, but I said, well, by the English transitive property, you're saying I believe, through logic. If I believe in love, you're saying I believe in God because it says that God is love. And so I said, okay, well, by that definition, I could maybe be okay with the idea of God. But I'd seen people abuse me and others in the name of God. We saw that, you said you were raised Catholic, like the pedophilia scandal with these poor children being abused by Catholic priests who were using God's name, and people stealing money in a church, or a televangelist, exploiting people and going after money, or people, a pastor abusing a woman in church and manipulating her by abusing his authority. These are all terrible things done in God's name. And so it can be easy to confuse sometimes who God really is when we look at abuse done in his name. And so a big part of my journey in the book, on this topic of forgiveness, is to forgive my dad, and to forgive people who hurt me and abused me, and to realize that's not God's will. God's will is not abuse. And God, and this is the human experience. God gave us free will. And with that comes the ability to hurt others. And faith requires the knowledge that God, we live in a constrained box of our humanity in a short lifespan relative to eternity. But God's not in a box. And so I do believe that God is just and merciful, and anything we have suffered will be restored to us, and we will be healed, either this side or the other side of heaven. Either way, God will be just to us. And he is allowing people to make these decisions now, because he has allowed, this is how he set it up. And we can either continue to fight against it or just accept it. And it doesn't mean that we have to allow an abuser to continue to abuse us. I think that's a very important thing to note in forgiveness. One person who really helped me with my forgiveness when I forgave my dad was this guy. I call him my forgiveness mentor. And his name is Anthony Thompson, and he lives in Charleston, South Carolina. And his wife, sadly, was murdered in that church shooting.
Oh my gosh.
In
Yes.
2015. And you had this white supremacist drive across the state from Columbia, South Carolina to Charleston. And he had he had researched, and he was hunting Black people, and he specifically killed 9 Black people in this church, and including my friend's wife. And it was this miraculous moment, though, because in the first bond hearing, and I'm not an attorney, but I've heard this is uncommon, the judge allowed the family members of the victims to speak to him directly, to the accused. And they said over and over repeatedly, I forgive you. I forgive you. God forgives you. Turn your life to God. Turn your life to Christ. A lot of them were Christian, including my friend who happens to be a pastor. And so Anthony forgave this murderer. And he said, and he ended up writing a book. The title is called To Forgive. And I read that book, and it really helped me with my forgiveness journey. But he makes a distinction in his book between forgiveness and reconciliation in terms of allowing an abuser into your life. And so the forgiveness is a single party event. That's something I do. The reconciliation is a 2 or more party event, and that is contingent on behavior and change from others. And I can't control reconciliation, but I can control forgiveness. And that goes back to your prayer earlier about Lord, grant us the serenity prayer, the wisdom to know the difference between what I can control and what I cannot. And that's, to me, the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation.
It's so true. Do you know what my husband always says? He says, hate the sin, but don't hate the sinner. What's your relationship with your mother now?
It's tough. It's tough because it's only as an adult now recently that I have understood more about how she really surrendered her power, and how she could have really done more to protect us. And when you look at the fruits of her parenting, to have 4 of your 8 biological children attempt suicide, to have 2 of them be severely schizophrenic, and they were healthy boys. They were healthy. And child abuse is strongly correlated with schizophrenia. And so I believe they would not have gotten that schizophrenia if they were not abused. And then another sibling who is completely, basically mentally disabled and on government welfare. So to have 3 of the 8 children on government programs, and the others, I think 7 of the 8 of us have been suicidal at one point. There's only one who I'm not sure. I don't believe they have. And so to look at those results as a mother and to say that it's my children's fault. My children are satanic. My parents would tell my 2 brothers, you got schizophrenia because you're evil. I just don't think that's healthy.
No. And
so for a long time, the thing is, my mother is an abuse victim also. Mm-hmm. But I think I hadn't realized how much she was also a perpetrator. And that's ultimately when we surrender our power over our own lives, we end up becoming a perpetrator, whether that is to the children in our lives or to ourselves. And I think that's what addiction ultimately is, mm-hmm. is self-sabotage and a perpetrator, that we are our own worst enemy. And we have to take responsibility for that. The fact that I struggled with suicidal ideation repeatedly over and over in different episodes over the years, that is fundamentally self-hatred. And I've had to look at myself in the mirror and forgive myself and say, Carrie, I'm sorry that I thought about killing you. That's what suicidal ideation is considering murdering yourself. Yeah. That's not okay. Mm-mm. And so to forgive myself for doing that, that's hard. It's hard to forgive the person who almost murdered you, So
But you
I,
know
I
that God, but you know that God already forgave you.
yeah, and it's can be a lot easier to know something intellectually, but to truly feel it, and even to forgive my mother, to truly forgive her. Um, I I intellectually do, and I emotionally feel lots of moments where I do, but it's still a journey.
It's human. And I can tell you, as I mentioned earlier, it's terrible to say, but when my mother passed on, it was so much easier for me. I didn't have to be angry anymore at what she had done because she was human and she was not able to change and get out. And I did just like you did. I left and I went and did my own thing and started a different journey. And I changed the generational trauma that had been going on. And that is so hard. And I know it's hard because I've done it myself. And as you mentioned, like all the material stuff doesn't make you, it's like, it's great. It's fabulous. It looks pretty, but it's not the insides and getting closer to God, which you have and I have, has given me this life that I never thought would be beyond my wildest dreams. And it is today.
Yeah, and I think one piece of advice I would give to anybody struggling with forgiveness, is to pray for them. Pray for the person who abused you. Sometimes I know it can be really hard, but it's hard to hate someone that you pray for.
It truly is. But there's
And
this saying,
and to know that, I'm sure with your mother's case, I'm guessing she had her own generational traumas,
yeah.
and it's not to justify at all any abuse. Um, but yeah, my mother was abused by my dad, so she was a victim. And so to pray for her healing, and to love her, even if I can't have a relationship with her right now because um, it's not healthy, but I can still have a healthy relationship with her by praying for her, and for loving her, and for feeling compassion for her, and doing anything I can behind the scenes to support her, and also recognizing my own failures. And again, I don't, I am so far from perfect, and I make mistakes and I make sin, and I say in the book, like, I am not a hero. At best, I am an anti-hero, and God is the true hero of our lives. And so, but to be more aware of my own failures, and to be aware of my own self-sabotage and my own contributions to not only the choices I've made that have hurt myself, but how I've impacted others negatively around me, and the bridges that I've burned. Because one thing about trauma, and I've been diagnosed with PTSD, um, is trauma responses create more trauma responses.
Mm.
And that's that generational cursing being passed down, just in the same way that the opposite is true. Generational blessing and kindness and all the fruits of the spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control, those can all accelerate and be passed down, and it really is a choice at the end of the day. But to be aware of how a trauma response is, how I would overreact to things. And I had not come to grips with the fact that a lot of these responses were coming from a place of trauma. And to feel like I'm a prisoner to my emotions. I'm a prisoner to, if I'm a drug or alcohol addict, then I'm a prisoner to my body and my genetics and my chemical responses to substances. The answer is no. The answer is no. And that's one thing I've been able to realize with God. You know, God is so much bigger than any addiction. God is so much bigger than the chemicals of my brain, the norepinephrine and serotonin and the drugs in my brain. God's so much bigger than all of them. And so to give power to these chemicals in my brain is to deny and to put them above God and to worship them. This is a fool's errand. And so it's helped me to even put things in those terms, to know the chemicals in my brain are, God is sovereign over them. They're subservient to him. And maybe I might feel like they are over me, but they are not over God. And so just surrendering it to God, and knowing he will be able to heal them and take care of what I've allowed to create in my brain, in this concept called neuroplasticity, which is, it's like little trees or shrubs or pathways in our brain. Well, these pathways can change. And so surrendering my neural pathways and my neuroplasticity to God, he'll renew it. And that's the clincher here, is that, as you mentioned about 12-step, there's so much scientific evidence. I did not know that quote about the Dalai Lama, but there's so much scientific evidence to show and prove quantitatively that people who are religious, believe in God, have individual worship practice and group and community worship practice, like going to church and getting your dress zipped up by your friend, community, people who are in church and do individual religious practice have significantly less suicide, significantly less depression, significantly less addiction, and significantly higher well-being, purpose, reporting of overall life satisfaction. And so if it's there in the science, why do we deny the science? And that's something that is, I've done a lot of research since the books come out about this. And it turns out that at least around the ballpark of 2/3 of therapists are atheist or agnostic.
Yep.
Whereas 81% of Americans say, I do believe in God. And so you have this big mismatch between the so-called experts over mental health and the people and what they want. There's a really great researcher named David Rosmarin at Harvard, and he has found that, I believe it was 73% of mental health care patients say, I want faith integrated into my mental health care. And yet 71% of therapists say, I have little to no training in how to do that. And so this is why we've never had more therapists, and yet we've never had more suicide. So something's wrong, and it's time that we pop that bubble and we bring in faith and mental health care together. And 12-step, I think, is a good example of that.
And this podcast for me is like my way of showing people, and having your book and meeting you in church that day and knowing that we believe in the same thing, which is healing, forgiveness, and trusting in God. I mean, God must have said to you how many times, you need to write a book, Carrie, you need to write a book. And you finally did it, I bet. Is that true?
Well, I call this my Paul book. Because in the Bible there was a guy named Saul,
Yeah.
but then he got a new name called Paul.
Yep.
And I had a first draft of my book, my Saul book. It was before I believed in God, and the working title of that book was The Heathen Next Door: How I Left Religion and Found Joy. And it was basically going to be a book bashing religion, saying it was great that America was becoming less religious, and how angry I was at what religion had done to my life and my family. And it's a long story, but God stopped me from writing that book. And in that period, I became a Christian. And so I had about 20,000 words written of the Saul book. And years later, I picked the book back up, 6 years later after I'd stopped writing it. And I had become a Christian. My life was totally different. And now you have the finished book. And so this is a testament to God, knowing that I'm going to keep working on her, and I'm going to change her heart. You know, the human heart, they say, is the hardest substance in the world, harder than a diamond. But once we're willing, and once we allow our hearts to be cracked open, then all bets are off, and God comes in and completely not only changes our hearts, but also rewires our brains. And so I love your podcast. I love what you're doing, Elizabeth. I love you. And thank you so much for having me.
It's been such a pleasure. I can't wait to see, what are you going to do next? Do you have any ideas to share with my listeners? Do you have any ideas?
Well, I have a nonprofit that I founded right when the book came out called Healthy Faith. So if anybody wants to get involved, if they want to make a contribution, it's tax deductible. Would love to have them. And I am going to continue telling this story of good news and continue building community around faith and mental health together. And that's my passion. And I'm not making money off that, but my day job is doing, as we discussed. But I believe at the end of the day, both that passion project and my day job, they're both aligned, because I'm fighting for freedom, whether that's freedom of our minds and our hearts, and then freedom for our country. It's freedom, but it's also responsibility, and that comes, like the Bible says, don't abuse your freedom to live a life that's ungodly. God gives us the spirit of freedom. That's, the Bible says, where the Holy Spirit is, there's the spirit of freedom. And so that's what I dedicate my life to, and would love to connect with folks.
Well, I'm going to put a link in there, and you guys, I'm going to put a link for Carrie's book and everything in the description, and you can go find her on all those little links. You don't have to go searching. It's right there in the description. God bless you, Carrie. Thank you so much for coming on. It has been such a pleasure getting to know you, and keep me in the loop of what's going on. I'd love to have you on again in the future.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's been a pleasure, and you are a light. I'm so glad to hear how you transformed yourself, and I'm glad that you're sharing stories of transformation. So keep going.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to Conversations with Bizzy. I hope you enjoyed today's show. If you did, if you could subscribe, that would mean the world to me. And follow me on all social media. And you can also get my newsletter every Friday morning into your inbox. Just go to elizabethchance.com and subscribe. Take care.